Forget the glamorous knights and fairy tale castles. The real story of the Middle Ages is hidden in the shadows, the lives of the peasants. These men and women made up the overwhelming majority of the population, yet they lived harsh, unforgiving lives. Their days were filled with backbreaking labor, they were vulnerable to hunger, disease, and war, and they faced the constant demands of feudal lords. But their story is far from static. Over the centuries, peasant life changed dramatically, shaped by technological advances, population shifts, and major crises like the Black Death. How did peasants eat, work, and survive in a world where every day brought new struggles? And how did they adapt as their world transformed around them? Stick around, and by the end of this video, you'll understand how these common folk were far more important to medieval history than they're often given credit for. Chapter 1: Life in the Early Middle Ages. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe splintered into fragmented communities. Cities dwindled, trade networks collapsed, and people sought protection wherever they could find it. During the early Middle Ages, manors became the backbone of survival. Small, self-sustaining worlds where peasants worked the land in exchange for protection from lords. Peasants weren't landowners. They toiled on their lords' fields and owed labor, crops, and payments for life events like marriages. In return, they received a small plot to farm for themselves. But the arrangement wasn't equal. The lord held power and the peasant bore the burden. The farming system in place was far from efficient. Most peasants used a two-field system, where half the land lay fallow each year to recover nutrients, resulting in lower productivity. Additionally, peasants relied on a basic scratch plow that was only suitable for light, sandy soils. So, survival depended on hard work, but nature was unforgiving. Tools were basic, crop yields were low, and bad weather or disease could mean famine. Peasants relied heavily on grains like barley and rye to make bread and gruel, which formed the bulk of their diet. In northern regions, peasants practiced easy masting, letting pigs roam oak forests to forage for acorns. This made pork a common staple, though fresh meat was considered a luxury and preserved meats were more typical. Dairy products like cheese and butter supplemented their diets, especially in areas with cattle. When harvests failed, peasants had to adapt quickly. They hunted wild game, fished in nearby streams, or gathered berries and nuts from the forests. But famine was a constant threat, and hunger often forced peasants to eat whatever they could find, including roots and, in some cases, tree bark. Their homes reflected this harsh reality. Peasant houses were simple structures of wood, clay, and straw. There was no luxury, just a central hearth for cooking and warmth. Smoke filled the room because there were no chimneys, and smoke escaped through small roof openings. Furniture was minimal. People lived alongside their animals to protect livestock from theft or harsh weather. Floors were made from packed dirt, and windows, if there were any, were covered with oiled cloth or animal hide to keep out drafts. Settlements were often temporary, as villages were frequently abandoned due to raids or natural disasters. Archaeological evidence shows that some early medieval villages lasted only a few centuries before being deserted. Villages became lifelines for peasants. These tight-knit communities centered around a church, which wasn't just a place of worship, it was where villagers sought guidance and found a sense of belonging. Festivals and market days were rare breaks from their routines, moments to strengthen social bonds and exchange goods. For example, during St. Martin's Day in November, peasants celebrated the end of the agricultural year with feasts and community gatherings. Festivals, religious holidays, and market days brought relief from the daily grind. These events allowed peasants to socialize, celebrate, and trade goods. The resilience of village communities, bolstered by shared traditions, helped them endure hardship. The church played a key role in mediating disputes and maintaining order, ensuring that community life continued despite hardships. But peasants were not free. They lived under serfdom, a system that tied them to the land. Unlike slaves, serfs couldn't be sold, but they couldn't leave without permission either. They owed their lords labor and goods, but they also had rights to their own small plots. This dependency provided some security, but it left little room for personal freedom. The hide, or mansus, was a standard unit of land measurement used to determine how much a family needed to sustain itself and what dues they owed to the lord. This system kept peasants bound to the manor, limiting their mobility. So they focused on subsistence farming, growing just enough to survive. Most peasants didn't produce surplus crops to sell. And without access to markets or preservation methods, hunger was a constant threat. If you're finding this journey into medieval life fascinating, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Imagine you're a medieval town crier. Shout out your insights so we can hear you loud and clear. We love hearing your take on history. Now let's move on into the High Middle Ages, where things start to change dramatically for peasants. Chapter 2. Life in the High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages from 1000 to 1300 AD marked a period of transformation for peasants in Europe. This era brought technological advancements, population growth, and significant changes in the social and economic structures of medieval society. For peasants, it meant more work, but also new opportunities. The introduction of the heavy plow and the widespread adoption of the three-field system revolutionized farming. The heavy plow allowed peasants to cultivate heavier, more fertile soils in Northern Europe, leading to increased agricultural productivity. The three-field system introduced crop rotation, reducing the risk of famine by ensuring a more stable food supply. As a result, villages grew, and some peasants were able to produce surplus crops for trade at local markets. Population growth during this period also transformed peasant life. Villages expanded, and new settlements were established as lords cleared forests and marshes to make way for farmland. In some regions, peasants began to move away from traditional serfdom by negotiating fixed rents instead of labor services. This shift gave peasants a greater sense of independence, though they were still bound by obligations to their lord. Housing and diet also saw gradual improvements during this time. Homes that had previously been made of simple wood and clay began to incorporate stone foundations and thatched roofs, offering better protection from the elements. Windows were covered with animal hides or wooden shutters, providing more insulation. Inside, peasants started to separate living quarters from livestock areas, which improved hygiene and quality of life. Their diets too became more varied. While bread and porridge remained staples, peasants gained access to seasonal fruits and vegetables, fish, and occasionally meat from livestock. Surplus food from successful harvests could now be sold at markets, providing opportunities to purchase goods they couldn't produce themselves, like salt and spices. Trade networks began to flourish, connecting rural villages to emerging towns and cities. Peasants who previously only farmed for subsistence started participating in the local economy by selling surplus crops, livestock, and handmade goods. This increased contact with townspeople and merchants exposed peasants to new ideas and opportunities. However, not all changes were positive. With growing populations came land scarcity. As villages expanded, available farmland became limited, forcing peasants to work harder to sustain their families. Social tensions also increased as lords demanded more taxes and labor from their tenants to fund their own ambitions, including castle building and participation in the Crusades. For example, in 1204, John of England imposed harsh taxes on his peasants to fund his military campaigns in France. This led to widespread discontent and, eventually, the Magna Carta in 1215, which limited the king's power and set a precedent for holding rulers accountable. Primarily a document for the nobility, the Magna Carta echoed a broader sentiment against unchecked authority. In the years that followed, peasants began to negotiate more favorable agreements with their lords, including fixed rents instead of unpredictable labor services. This shift gradually reduced the burdens of serfdom and gave peasants a sense of stability and autonomy that had previously been out of reach. The High Middle Ages also saw the rise of peasant cooperatives, where villagers worked together to manage common lands and share resources. These cooperatives fostered a sense of community and mutual support, helping peasants endure the difficulties of medieval life. Overall, life in the High Middle Ages was one of both continuity and change. Peasants still faced the harsh realities of manual labor, hunger, and obligations to their lords, but they also began to see new possibilities for economic and social mobility. This period laid the groundwork for the more dramatic transformations that would come in the late Middle Ages. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into medieval life, hit that subscribe button. Think of it as swearing fealty to me, your friendly host here at Stash Chronicles. Don't leave me hanging like a medieval tapestry. Chapter 3. Life in the Late Middle Ages. The Late Middle Ages, from 1300 to 1500 AD, brought immense changes to the lives of peasants, driven by a series of major crises and social transformations. This period is marked by war, famine, and plague, all of which reshaped the economic and social fabric of Europe. The most significant of these was the Black Death, which decimated the population, wiping out as much as 1/3 of Europe's people. The impact of the plague on peasant life was profound. Entire villages were abandoned, fields were untended, and the social order began to crumble. Whole regions, such as Tuscany in Italy and parts of Normandy in France, saw massive depopulation, leaving landowners desperate for labor. But for those who survived, the dramatic population loss brought unexpected opportunities. With fewer workers available, labor became a valuable commodity. Peasants, who had long been tied to the land and bound by obligations to their lords, found themselves in a position of bargaining power. In places like England, surviving peasants began negotiating for higher wages and better living conditions, challenging the traditional feudal order. The Statute of Labourers in England, enacted in 1351, attempted to freeze wages and restrict peasants' mobility, but it was largely ineffective. The traditional feudal system was beginning to break down. One of the most famous events of this period was the Peasants' Revolt in 1381 in England. Led by Wat Tyler, thousands of peasants marched on London to demand an end to serfdom, lower taxes, and greater rights. The revolt was sparked by heavy taxation to fund military campaigns, particularly the controversial poll tax, which burdened the poorest. A radical preacher during the Peasants' Revolt said, "They have the wine, the spices, and the good bread. We have the rye, the husks, and the straw, and we drink water. They have shelter and ease in their fine manners, and we have hardship and toil, the wind and the rain in the fields." As peasants gathered in towns, their demands grew louder, pushing for radical reforms, including the abolition of unpaid labor obligations and redistribution of land. Although the revolt was ultimately crushed, it sent a clear message that peasants were no longer willing to accept their status without protest. Similar uprisings occurred across Europe, including the Jacquerie in France, a violent and chaotic uprising in 1358 sparked by heavy war taxation and noble abuses, and revolts in Flanders and Germany where peasants demanded fairer rents and the reduction of feudal dues. Housing and diet also evolved during the late Middle Ages. Peasant homes became more permanent structures, often built with stone foundations and wooden beams. Villages were better organized with common lands for grazing and shared mills for processing grain. However, food shortages and famine were still common, particularly during times of war or poor harvests. Despite the turmoil, trade and commerce expanded during the late Middle Ages. Peasants who previously relied solely on subsistence farming began to participate in local markets, selling surplus crops and handmade goods. This increased economic activity helped to reshape rural life, creating a more complex social structure in villages. Overall, life in the late Middle Ages was marked by uncertainty and change. The old feudal order was beginning to give way to new social and economic arrangements. Peasants were no longer passive subjects, but active participants in the transformation of medieval society. They pushed back against traditional hierarchies, negotiated better terms with their lords, and began to see a future that offered more autonomy and opportunity. Through the centuries, the lives of medieval peasants evolved from one of servitude and survival to a dynamic period of change. The early Middle Ages saw peasants bound to their lords, isolated in self-sustaining manners. By the High Middle Ages, innovation in farming and a growing market economy offered glimpses of opportunity. And in the late Middle Ages, crises like the Black Death shattered the old order, giving peasants newfound power to negotiate their futures. The story of medieval peasants is one of resilience, adaptation, and transformation. Their struggles, revolts, and quiet persistence shaped the social and economic foundations of Europe. Though they lived in the shadows of castles and cathedrals, their legacy is no less significant. If you enjoyed this journey into medieval history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Stash Chronicles to keep me motivated to bring you more stories from history's most fascinating eras. Leave a comment below. What surprised you the most about peasant life? We promise no medieval taxes on your opinions. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Check out my sources below and see you in the next one.